Hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation. I'm Rebecca Willett.
And I'm Layla Coleman.
And we'll be sharing observations and analysis of a classroom project at UW-Madison that investigated young people's experiences with misinformation.
So to start with, this project aimed to highlight and center young people's voices. We wondered, what do young people think about educational approaches to fake news? Are these approaches aligning with their own experiences? Are they even relevant? And so with these wonderings in mind, we identified 3 questions to support our work. How do young people understand their experiences of disinformation ecologies? How do young people perceive their own and their peers' media literacy skills connected with mis or disinformation? And how do young people view educational approaches to mis and disinformation? We considered framing this project from a library and information studies perspective as an information literacy project. But as we delved into definitions of information literacy and analyzed our data set, we came to the conclusion that this is more of a media literacy research project with a focus on socially situated approaches to literacies. Additionally, our choice to follow a student-led investigation of our mis or disinformation generated an exploration of not only how young people were experiencing mis or disinformation, but also on health topics, health education, and social media influencers, as these were all topics that students identified as being particularly important to investigate in regards to misinformation. So as you can see here in the Venn diagram, our data set led us to this specific space and considers young people's experiences with misinformation primarily as they experienced misinformation about health topics on social media.
So we worked with a group of first-year undergrads. It was a fairly small group, 18, in the fall of 2022. The undergrads were part of a course I was teaching that covered misinformation and fake news from a variety of disciplines: history, journalism, political science, and so on. And after studying misinformation, students conducted their own research in small groups with this prompt: how do young people find, exchange, understand, and/or act on misinformation and disinformation? As part of their small group research projects, they did mini lit reviews. They designed and implemented surveys of their peers, mainly in their dorms, and they prepared presentations of their findings. So you can see the list of chosen topics here. They all chose topics related to health, in spite of me suggesting a whole range of non-health related areas of possible study. So Layla came in and observed this process of them doing their research projects. And so our data set is a set of observational notes, including lots of quotes from the students that you'll be hearing about in this presentation. So while they were even writing their research question, they were telling us something about how they viewed misinformation. When they designed the survey, we got lots of information about how they were understanding the whole ecologies that they wanted to investigate, the kinds of questions they asked, the list of responses they provided for their survey respondents all gave us information. They garnered about 50 to 100 responses to their surveys, and their discussion of their survey results gave us further information because they had to turn these results into a 10-minute presentation. So we had all this observational data that we analyzed and are sharing with you today. So the analysis of the data is quite exploratory, but we found 2 major themes that emerged during our process of analysis that we'll be sharing with you today.
So what did we find? Again, the first theme of the 2, as Rebecca noted, is that young people's understanding of their experiences with misinformation. Within this theme, we followed 2 different threads. The first being that sociocultural contexts shape how young people encounter and experience misinformation. One of the first noticings within our analysis was that students interacted with misinformation really differently in different sociocultural contexts. While educators can frequently draw on fake news articles or sometimes use unreliable sources to teach about misinformation in classrooms, our students told us we don't go looking for information. We want information to come to us. And they live in a world where it does. So encountering misinformation about nutrition or vaping within the context of one's own curated social media feed is significantly different than examining it via a PowerPoint in an academic classroom, according to our students. And within those social media feeds, our participants stated that their preference really was also to stay in app and to keep scrolling. So social cultural context generated by their individual engagement within the specific social media ecologies of these very distinct platforms, such as TikTok and Snapchat and Instagram, those all can shape their interest in working to refute that misinformation or not. One student noted, people do not fact check about this kind of information. Most of them said that is an extra step. And on social media, the act is that you're just scrolling versus needing to go to a different page. So fully acknowledging how young people are engaging with information and misinformation means to also expanding beyond the framing that's provided by more traditional definitions of information literacy and media literacy. We found that multiliteracies as a framework acknowledges the challenges of a post-truth era and considers socially constructed aspects of meaning making. So here, in alignment with the work of Parker and Smith, we really were in agreement that educators must acknowledge the changing nature of how students are spending their time, as that has implications for how they're building their knowledge and how they're making meaning in the world. And lastly, under this subtheme, in a point surprising both Rebecca and I, students also shared and found that their peers frequently share misinformation because it is funny. Within certain social cultural contexts, with one specific group of friends or in-app in certain feeds, young people will share fake news or misinformation as a source of entertainment. When we acknowledge that experiences with misinformation are shaped by social cultural factors, we can easily see how a student might share something to be funny in one context and then be really skeptical or just ignore misinformation in yet another. The second subtheme we had here, highlighted in regards to young people's experiences with misinformation, was that social identity is tightly entwined with young people's experiences of misinformation. In a large systematic review investigating how adolescents trust the health information that they find or experience on social media, authors Freeman et al. Found that adolescents, for them, engaging with content in social media is just as much about presenting and understanding who you are within the social community as it is about finding factual health information. And while moving through their research projects, our students also noted that young people focus on engaging with content that resonates with them, whether it is true or not. We found that this also aligns with research showing that young people are more likely to share information if it connects to them and to their interests, regardless of truthfulness. Young people can also be motivated by this need to reaffirm their identity or to convey certain affinities or interests. And this can lead them to share content that supports identity construction, but might not consider if that information is factual or not. The students within our study were also highly aware of the prevalence of social media influencers in their feeds. And while they reported being skeptical of this influencer content, they also discussed being in comparison or connection to influencers a lot. While discussing the formation of their survey questions that they were going to take and ask their peers, one group chose to ask, during the pandemic, how much pressure did you feel to fix or change your health and wellness practices? We were engaging with influencers during the pandemic and watching what they were doing every day. Were they taking advantage of us? This is an important note because audience involvement or identification with celebrity influencers can further increase our susceptibility to misinformation. The idea that one's identity is merging with a celebrity influencer's persona is an important possibility to consider when acknowledging the connections between who we are or who we view ourselves to be, and then how we experience misinformation in these common social media spaces.
So our second kind of major theme is about how the students position their own media literacy skills and other young people's skills in relation to misinformation and disinformation. Here we found two sub-themes that appear contradictory. So on the one hand, young people position themselves as skilled and able to spot misinformation. And on the other hand, they position themselves as vulnerable to misinformation. So as part of this COVID generation of young people, these students' lives are digital by default. And our students made a connection between their digital lives and their media literacies. So young people position themselves in our study as having implicit knowledge about misinformation and disinformation gained through their personal experience of using media in their digital by default lives. So students said that they and their peers consume social media and have been doing so for years. And importantly, they said that they developed skills as they engaged with social media, which they describe as inherent knowledge and inherent skills. So when they were discussing their survey responses, they said that 97% of participants had viewed misinformation about fitness. This tells us that teens can identify misinformation due to our growing up online. So what does this mean? They said that growing up online gave them these inherent skills. So they know when to scroll past or simply laugh at things that are obviously fake. They devalue content that's posted by people who have an obvious agenda, like influencers. They're accustomed to seeing conflicting information and then investigating claims if the information matters to them personally. And they're used to seeing misinformation, so they're generally skeptical. This aligns with research about the ways that young people learn the norms and the practices of online spaces, partly from interacting in these spaces in different ways. We want to say that we're not taking these statements from our students at face value. We know that self-reporting is problematic. This idea that digital natives have these innate skills is a myth. And we know that young people, and especially boys, often overestimate their digital competencies. But importantly, we think that this way of positioning themselves as having gained skills and knowledge through their experience of using social media is partly a response to how educators have approached the topic and positioned teens. So our second sub-theme is that adults underestimate teens' media literacy skills. So one of the students said, teens are not mindlessly scrolling through social media. Students have more control over their actions than one may think. So students indicated that adults position teens as easily duped by fake news and misinformation online. And this ignores their social media skills, and it dismisses the amount of agency that they have in these spaces. Further, in this quote from the student, we see the student drawing on a risk discourse about the addictive nature of social media and deficit models of young people. And this positioning of children and teens as vulnerable to online risk is prevalent in media panics, which then create a narrow understanding of what skills children and teens need. So for example, when framed through a risk discourse, being digitally literate means being able to use the internet safely and responsibly. And our students said they are interested in a much broader approach to media literacy. So our third and final sub-theme is that young people do feel vulnerable and they are concerned about the impacts of misinformation. So the students are not saying that schools have nothing to teach them. They are concerned about the impacts of misinformation on their lives. One student said, there's this focus on propaganda and fake news, but not why we should care. Like, what does it actually mean, or what does it make people do? So in this lens, it's not surprising that most of the students in our study chose health topics. They see themselves as more vulnerable to misinformation about health and well-being, and vulnerable in a way that has a direct impact on their health. And at the same time, health and well-being is seen by our students as something which they have agency over. They can choose to use vapes or not. So they were very critical of the approach to misinformation in high schools, which they called surface level education that's not at all applicable to the real world. And it's in this context that they position themselves as wanting better media education. So one student said, young people and teenagers are vulnerable to feeling uncertain about diet and exercise disinformation because there's so little curriculum about health disinformation. So we think part of the reason students express this feeling of vulnerability is because media and information literacy is often framed by educators and other stakeholders as addressing risks. And this positions children and teens as having deficits, as not having the skills to deal with online risks. So in some ways, it's no wonder that our students express this feeling of vulnerability.
So our primary wonderings after moving through these findings within the project were to consider how a project like this might inform educational efforts and schools' approaches to misinformation. We felt that pedagogical approaches rooted in asset-based models would better recognize students' digital competencies and support those particular vulnerabilities, especially within social media ecologies or concerning health topics. The students were quick to note how irrelevant or even dismissive some examples of information or media literacy instruction lessons could be. Additionally, school curriculum, in our view, should consider misinformation within the context of social media ecologies and recognize the impacts of things like influencer culture. As our students noted, the news and mis and disinformation are often coming to them, and it is coming to them through these means. And lastly, we believe that's important to note the role of pleasure here. So providing young people with a framework as well as the discourse to discuss the pleasure of consuming misinformation or making fun of misinformation found in the media, that's important. They're already sharing misinformation for entertainment purposes, so discussing why that may be or what purpose that might serve becomes even more impactful here. And so in conclusion, we see this as a small study, but with the potential to inform a bigger project. Some possibilities for further research or where we might see this go include perhaps a wide-scale youth participatory action project where young people worked to develop information and misinformation curriculum. Perhaps a further investigation into how some of the social cultural contexts and social identities are shaping young people's engagement with other types of misinformation.
So thank you for watching our presentation, and please do not hesitate to reach out to us at the emails listed on the screen.